All right, good. Messing up. I like that answer because failure to fail is just our first attempt at learning. F-A-I-L, our first attempt at learning. Okay, so if you make a mistake or you fail at something, it's okay, just keep trying and go again. That ties into the answers that I see y'all putting for personal experiences or experience, okay? How do you learn what to do and what not to do? You make mistakes. Or you could learn from someone else's mistakes through observing others. Okay, so if any of you have older siblings, that's funny, Ella, how you put making mistake. Was that on purpose? Because you made a mistake. It's all big brain. So if y'all have older siblings, you may have let them get in trouble and then you learned from their mistakes that you didn't repeat that. Or by the time your parents got around to you, they were too tired to actually raise you because it was like, oh, we've already gone through this many kids, right? I swear, like the baby of the siblings always has it the easiest because by then the parents are just like, we got two already through. This last one, you're on your own. And the example of your peers, so you could also learn from your peers. That's part of the reason we do peer reviews for essays, right? So that y'all can learn from the mistakes of others. Or if you get an essay that's really good, you could learn how to fix your own mistakes based on how they did it right. Okay. Accidentally chugging grape medicine. Okay, I'm sure that would be a very interesting mistake to make, Samothy, but we're going to pass right on over that. So first, if we're going to define how do we learn, we have to define what learning is. And learning is a relatively, great, my pen's not going to work. Hold on. Pen, yes, pen. Absolutely not. Okay, so I'm just going to go in the chat. Oh, there's Felix. Okay, so learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior. And that can result from experience or practice. So y'all have listed experience in the chat for a way that we learn things, but what about practice? Those of you who are athletes, how do you learn how to play your sport? Okay, you learn through practice. You don't just show up on the day of a game and play against the opposing team. Y'all have to show up for multiple times before a game in order to run plays or whatever it is that athletic people do. I wouldn't know. Okay, so this results from your experience. Sometimes it's a one-time experience that makes a strong enough impression for you to learn from it. Sometimes you have to do it over and over. For instance, writing essays or learning your alphabet, you have to do that over and over again in order to really imprint it into your memory. But learning does not include instinct or reflex. Okay, that does not include learning. So if someone throws something at your face, you're going to instinctively protect your face, right? You don't have to learn how to react with a reflex. If you go to a doctor and they do that little hammer thing on your knee, okay, you don't have to learn how to kick. You automatically do that. Or if you're a baby, all right, you don't have to learn how to wrap your hand completely around someone else's finger. You just instinctively do that. It's a part of your survival instinct. So don't confuse learning with instinct or reflexes. So when we talk about certain animals like spiders or geese, things that they do instinctively aren't things that they have to observe others doing. Like a spider doesn't watch another spider build a web and think, aha, I'm going to do what they did. Or same thing with geese. They don't just see a bunch of other geese flying south and they're like, well, I don't want to be the only one left in the north and then follow along, right? It's something that's instinctual. This also ties very closely to behaviorism. You may remember that under behaviorism, we studied the tabula rasa, those early philosophers prior to the emergence of psychology as a science. John Locke, under the tabula rasa, said that everyone's born with a blank slate. How do we write upon that slate? Through experiences. A baby learns how to talk or how to walk or how to write through those experiences being written on their tabula rasa. Does that make sense? And so the behaviors are going to be a very big part of this unit. Why isn't it working? There we go. Nope. All right. So there are some videos throughout this unit that I would encourage y'all to watch that are in the lecture series in Unit 4, but we're not going to watch many of them in class. There are going to be a few that we watch, but not a great number of them. So the type of learning that we're looking at is associative learning. Associative means that things are associated together or they are linked. Both classical and operant conditioning are types of associative learning. With classical conditioning, remember that it is involuntary behavior. Okay, so that's going to include like fear or salivation. It's not something that you decide to do. Like with little Albert, John Watson pairs the fear of a white rat, okay, with a loud noise, so that every time little Albert sees something white and furry, he responds with that same involuntary behavior of fear. Whereas operant, think of operant as you are operating, as in you are making decisions. That's going to deal with voluntary behavior. That's where we're going to get reinforcement and punishment. Okay, so if your parents want you to study more, you make the conscious decision to study, so that would fall under operant conditioning. You don't just involuntarily, accidentally study, right? Although some of you are like, yeah, no, I involuntarily study all the time. So with that, you pair an unconditioned stimulus with a conditioned response. And some of these things we're going to be able to see in picture form. For instance, when you look at this picture, this is a stationary image, but what do you associate with that event? A pop. Good, Sam. So you can hear this image. Okay, have y'all seen that meme where it's like you can't hear an image and then it posts something and you're like, wait a minute, I can. Okay, so you can actually associate this still image, this 2D image of a man holding something sharp next to a balloon with a noise. Okay, so you may look at that and instinctually you kind of like take aback a little bit, like, oh, it's about to make a loud noise. You've come to associate a balloon popping with that. What about with this picture? What do you associate with this? Like, yeah, it's bad that I'm putting this right before lunch, right? And don't think, oh, I see a picture of food, so I associate it with food. Think about something that's not obvious. When you see, for instance, a turkey and pumpkins and green beans and cranberries and mashed potatoes and gravy, what do you associate with that? Okay, murdered natives and mean pilgrims. That's one association. It is an American holiday. Thanksgiving. Okay, so what do you associate with that picture? Thanksgiving. What do you associate with Thanksgiving? Your friends and family. Back, Sam, these are white people. Back in my day when I was in college, we wouldn't always get to visit our family, depending on like how far away we were, or if we're like, oh, we'll only go for a week and then we'll be back and then we're gone for the winter break. And so we would hold Friendsgiving. And so it'd be just a bunch of us gathering in someone's apartment or dorm, and we'd all bring food, usually not something we made ourselves because we wanted to actually eat it. So we would go out and buy something to bring to the Friendsgiving and have a good little gathering with that. So I associate this not only with family, but also with friends. Okay, so we've made associations with those things. Now, the three types of associative learning that we're going to cover is classical conditioning, which, remember, you should write this down in your notes, that this is involuntary behavior. Classical conditioning. Sam, I think like right under your comment, you say white people, and then you say that's such an amazing idea. And I'm just like, actually, for most of world history, it's the worst idea. All right, so classical conditioning, this is by association or consequence with involuntary behavior. Okay, so salivation or fear. Then we go into operant conditioning. That is voluntary behavior through association and consequence. So you get the dichotomy of reinforcement, which is a type of reward, and also punishment, which is the opposite of a reward. So whether you're trying to increase that voluntary behavior or decrease the voluntary behavior. And then finally, modeling. So some of y'all put in your chat comments about how you learn is you learn by observing others. Modeling is exactly that. You observe others, okay? They could be an example of what to do or an example of what not to do, okay? Like a warning, for instance. Y'all may be familiar with the comedy show The Office. And within The Office, there's actually an episode where Jim Halpert actually classically conditions Dwight Schrute. Okay, remember that with classical conditioning, we're dealing with involuntary behavior. So while we watch this short clip from The Office, I want y'all to keep that in mind. I want you to look for what is the involuntary behavior that Dwight Schrute is doing in response to this classical conditioning. If I ever get my computer to work. And with this, we're going to start identifying some important key terms within classical conditioning. There's going to be the UCS, which is the unconditioned stimulus, the UCR, which is the unconditioned response, the neutral stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. So we're going to identify each of those in this video once we finish watching it. Can y'all see the screen okay? You can see classical conditioning, The Office? Okay. Come on now.
I have to reboot again. Do you want an outside?
Okay, so if we're looking at that as a concept of classical conditioning, what was the involuntary behavior that Jim trained Dwight into doing? Come on now.
Reaching his hand out for a minute.
Now that's a voluntary behavior. Okay?
Oh, no.
You choose to reach your hand out. So what did he say in, why isn't this presenting? What did he say at the very end was happening with his mouth in that video?
Started tasting nasty.
Exactly. It started tasting weird. Okay. So in order to make this easier, we're just going to associate it with salivation. Okay. So looking back in the chat at those terms that I gave y'all, the UCS, the UCR, the NS, the CS, and the CR, we're going to identify what in this video was the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the neutral stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. Now, this is very commonly used in free response questions, y'all. They may give you a situation and they'll ask, okay, what was the neutral stimulus that was paired with the unconditioned stimulus? Okay, so what these terms mean is an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that causes a response that you already know. Okay, if I put a McRib in front of you, okay, you don't have to learn that the McRib is delicious, right? Some of you are like, no, it's bad. It's bad. It's like, not now, McRib. 2020 is already bad enough, okay? But if I put really good smelling food in front of you, you don't have to learn how to be hungry, right? You're just naturally gonna want to eat the McRib, Okay, so you pair the unconditioned stimulus with something that elicits a response automatically. So when I put food in front of you, that's the stimulus. And your automatic response that you don't have to learn, it's just natural, is you being hungry. Okay, so what was the unconditioned stimulus in this video? And what was Dwight's response to that stimulus that he didn't have to learn? It was just naturally occurring. What was presented to him?
Wasn't it a mint?
It was a mint. It was the Altoid. Okay, Jim gave him the Altoid. That is your unconditioned stimulus. Now, what happens to y'all's mouth when you eat an Altoid or a mint? I at least start to salivate. Okay, so your unconditioned stimulus is the mint, the Altoid, and your unconditioned response, which is your response to the Altoid, is salivation. Now, Jim is going to pair something completely unrelated with that mint. That's the neutral stimulus. What does Jim pair with the mint? Every time he gives Dwight a mint, he pairs what with it?
The sound on the computer.
Good, the computer rebooting noise. So computer noise. Notice how he gave the mint very quickly after the computer rebooted. That's called contiguity. If you want to make acquisition happen faster with a subject, you need to pair the UCS with the NS very closely together in time. So it wasn't like the computer booted up and then 30 seconds later, he gave him the mint. It was as soon as the computer rebooted, he handed him the Altoid. Okay, so you want to get those two as closely together as possible in order to make what's known as acquisition, which is when they learn to associate the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. Eventually, once you pair that neutral stimulus enough times with the UCS, it becomes the conditioned stimulus. Okay, the neutral stimulus replaces it. So the conditioned stimulus is the computer noise. So I need y'all to write in your notes that the NS equals the CS. The neutral stimulus is always going to be the conditioned stimulus. It remains the same. So now instead of an Altoid making Dwight's mouth taste bad, now the computer noise is going to make his mouth taste bad. So now our unconditioned response becomes the conditioned response. That's another thing you need to write. I almost wrote salvation. Like, no, that's not it. Salivation. Okay. You also need to write that the unconditioned response equals the conditioned response. Whenever you write an FRQ where it asks about UCS, UCR, NS, CR, CS, all of that, make sure you know which ones remain the same over time. The neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus after you pair it enough times with the UCS. The response is always going to be the same. First, their response to the Altoid was salivation, then they're going to associate it instead with a computer noise. So CR equals UCR. They remain the same. So who discovered this? It wasn't Jim Halpert. It was Ivan Pavlov. And he didn't discover this with humans. Instead, he discovered this with dogs. So that was a quite timely arrival of y'all's corgis to this lesson at the beginning of the class. What had happened was, y'all may remember this image at the top of our Schoology page, right? And you may have been like, what on earth is Miss McNeely putting pictures of at the top of our page? What is going on with this class? Well, Ivan Pavlov had originally been studying dogs, not for classical conditioning or for learning, but instead he had been studying their spit. He had been studying the role that salivation plays on digestion, which it turns out there is a role. But while doing that, he had to hook up these dogs in such a way for him to collect their spit in order to study how spit helped with digestion. Now, as a byproduct of that, he discovered that whenever he arrived to give the dogs food in order to start the digestion, they would start to salivate. So he's trying to collect their spit, but he discovers that when he starts showing up, they start going ahead and salivating before he's put any food out. So he's like, why is it that these dogs during these trials start salivating before I even give them the food? And so he became interested in this side quest, basically. And he wanted to discover why these dogs were salivating at the wrong time. And that's because they had made acquisition. They had been classically conditioned to associate the researchers with food. So now, whenever the researchers showed up, they knew, oh, that means food time, and they would start an involuntary behavior, the involuntary behavior of salivation. So if you're looking for a definition of classical conditioning, this is a type of learning that links a neutral stimulus, or an NS, to another stimulus that evokes an involuntary response. A type of learning that links a neutral stimulus to another stimulus that evokes an involuntary response. And if you want to see this in action, there is a video in the Schoology notes. It's only about like 4 minutes, I think, tops, that shows these dogs in the midst of this experiment. Okay, so let's do with these dogs what we did with Jim and Dwight from The Office. We need to label the UCS, the UCR, the NS, the CS, and the CR. So in this experiment, the dog tastes food, the dog drools involuntarily, and then Pavlov pairs a whistle with before feeding and during feeding. So every time these dogs get fed, he rings a bell or blows a whistle. And he has to do this over and over and over again. Once the dog learns to salivate at the sound of the whistle, this is when we've reached the period of acquisition. Okay, acquisition is when the subject has learned to pair the original stimulus with the new stimulus to elicit that involuntary response. So go ahead and in the chat, for this example, what is the unconditioned stimulus that Pavlov brought to the dogs? The unconditioned stimulus. Good, food. And that food elicited an unconditioned response. What was the dog's response to that food? Now remember, it has to be an involuntary response. Salivating, good, they drooled. So the unconditioned stimulus is food, and the unconditioned response is salivation. Well, what did Pavlov pair with the food? What was his neutral stimulus that was unrelated that he added in whenever he fed them? The whistle sound, good. So that whistle or that bell becomes the neutral stimulus. Now we know that the neutral stimulus is the same as the what? The CS, good. So the neutral stimulus eventually becomes a conditioned stimulus. After the period of acquisition, the dogs begin to associate the sound of the whistle with what? Food, okay? And so now whenever the whistle blows, what is the dog's conditioned response to that whistle? They salivate because the CR is the same as the UCR. Okay, so just to recap, the unconditioned stimulus was the food. The unconditioned response to the food was drooling. Then they paired the food with a whistle. That's the neutral stimulus, until the dogs learn to associate the whistle with food time. And that means that it becomes the conditioned stimulus, resulting in the conditioned response of salivation. Okay, now the way to make that acquisition happen faster is through contiguity. I think I'm spelling that right. Contiguity. That means you pair the whistle as close as possible to the food. You don't give the dogs the food and then 30 minutes later blow a whistle or ring a bell, because the dogs aren't going to know what that means. They're just going to think there's this random person ringing a bell. Okay, you want to make sure as close to lunchtime as possible. Okay, and we go through the same thing. Our meal times, typically our lunchtime is around 11:30. Okay, we start to associate 11:30 with time to eat. So even if you're not hungry, you may stop and feel like, okay, I need to eat. I should be feeling hunger around this time because I didn't eat breakfast and it's lunchtime. Okay. Or you may think, oh, I'm in fifth period. So you start associating fifth period with food. So you're always going to be hungry during fifth period. Whereas maybe on a weekend, you wouldn't get hungry until 1 o'clock, just depending. Okay, so you're classically conditioned throughout your day-to-day lives just as well. Okay, so to review this, looking at the dog, before conditioning, the food created an automatic response, an involuntary response of salivation. You pair that whistle without anything and you see that there's no conditioned response. The whistle is meaningless. Okay, so they weren't already trained to salivate at the whistle. Then you pair it together and the dog acquires the response of salivation in response to the sound of the whistle. Okay, I know like I'm repeating all of this over and over again, but it's simply because this is one of the key elements in the AP psychology exam that they like to focus on a lot. People always get confused about classical conditioning. They always confuse it with voluntary behavior, or they confuse the stimuli and the responses. So it's key that you learn these tips and tricks early on, so when you do face this on the AP exam or on our Unit 4 exam, you actually know how to answer it. Okay, so let's do another example. Let's do an example of children and night terrors. So in this example, the child is laying in bed. Now remember that this type of behavior has to be involuntary. Okay, so wanting to go to sleep or climbing into bed can't be the conditioned response. It has to be something that is involuntary. So in this scenario, a child is laying in bed and then when they're asleep, they have a night terror. Okay, they wake up and they're super scared. So now they have a classical conditioning of associating the bed with an involuntary response. So go ahead and in the chat, figure out what that conditioning, what that acquisition is. What was the unconditioned stimulus that led to an unconditioned response? And then what did the child start to associate together? Okay, the unconditioned stimulus is a night terror. What was the unconditioned response to that night terror?
Fear.
Fear, because fear is an involuntary behavior. So what was the neutral stimulus, the unrelated stimulus that the child associates? Yeah, the bed. So the UCS is the night terror. The UCR is terror or fear. And so the neutral stimulus of what are you usually asleep in when you have night terrors, that's going to be your bed. So now the bed becomes associated with fear. So this conditioned stimulus is bed, And the conditioned response is still fear, just like the unconditioned response is fear. But what's notable about classical conditioning and fear is that you don't need nearly as many pairings in order to make that association. Okay, this is why PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder can be so debilitating. Okay, with PTSD, there are certain triggers that are associated with them. And those triggers can, no pun intended, trigger a fear response. Okay, so in near-death experiences or in experiences with heightened fear or complex PTSD, which is when you go through multiple experiences with negative consequences, that can be enough to make that connection between something as normal as riding a bus. Well, now riding a bus is associated with fear. Okay, so if you're in a car accident, for instance, okay, you may associate driving with near-death experiences. And so getting in the car, not just in the passenger side, but in the driver's side, okay, or even watching Fast and Furious, okay, that might trigger a fear response. And what's unique about that type of response is that it typically only needs very few pairings or one pairing, especially in the event of a near-death experience, okay? So how are we going to evolve this beyond just studying dogs and animals to studying humans? Well, John Watson is going to expand classical conditioning to deal with observable behavior of humans. Remember that in behaviorism, their main focus is only on what you can quantify. They don't care about your feelings. They don't care about your thoughts, right? That's cognitive psychology. With behaviorism, they only want to look at what they can measure. And he's going to be the one behind the little Albert experiment. Now, with this experiment, he takes a baby, right? And he's going to get that baby to learn how to fear white furry animals. Okay, so this is another one of those videos that I'm going to pull up that we're going to watch together. So we're actually going to see clips from that video. And the reason that this experiment is so controversial is because, one, it's unethical. You should not be teaching babies to be afraid of stuff, right? And then even if you do, after the experiment is over, you should maybe help them unlearn that fear. Well, that debriefing didn't occur with little Albert. His mother was a single mom and she got paid like $8 or something for him to be involved in this study. I mean, she needed the money. And so they never actually unclassically conditioned him. And so there was this huge interest in what happened to baby Albert after the experiment. Did he live to grow up to be an adult who was afraid of rabbits? And actually, he lived long enough to be 8 years old before he died of a fever. So they did actually, yeah, I'm sorry, Sam. They did actually find little Albert, but they hadn't unconditioned him. But he didn't meet some untimely death because of rabbits or rats. Okay, but in the future, for ethical experiments, whatever you do to the subject, you want to make sure you undo afterwards. So let's watch this brief clip.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats.
That dog's so happy. Good boy.
Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats, whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
But to be fair, the white mask is terrifying in and of itself. You'll see in a second. Even a teddy bear, he's like, no, I don't want it. See, objectively terrifying. He was like, I'm leaving. Okay, so what were the UCS, the UCR, the NS, and the conditioned response to little Albert's experience? Okay, so how is he classically conditioned? He hears a loud bang and he is startled from the bang. Okay, along with the loud bang, that's paired with a white rat. So now anytime Albert sees anything white and fluffy, he becomes scared. So what is the unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response in that example? Remember that the unconditioned response has to be an involuntary behavior. Okay, the unconditioned stimulus is the loud noise. And what is the response that that causes in little Albert that he doesn't have to learn, that he just automatically responds with? Fear. Okay, so loud noise equals fear. Then they're going to pair the loud noise with what? What's the neutral stimulus? The white rat. Okay, so now that neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. After 6 pairings, he acquires the association between white rat and loud noise. So the conditioned stimulus becomes the white rat, but the conditioned response is still going to be the same. It's still the response of fear. Okay, so we noted that after this experiment, what the experimenters should have done was decondition little Albert to break that association between the rat and fear. And that is something that's possible in classical conditioning. There's a concept known as extinction. And this is commonly used in therapy where they're trying to overcome fears, like phobias, for instance, like claustrophobia, which isn't the fear of Santa Claus, it's the fear of small enclosed places, right? And so in order to do that, you need to practice extinction. This is when a or a conditioned response no longer follows the conditioned stimulus. So what if after the experiment, John Watson had placed baby Albert with a white rat repeatedly and not made any noise? There had been 0 banging noises. Then eventually that association between white furry rat and fear would have been broken. Okay, same thing with our example of night terrors. They had associated being in bed with nightmares. So they associated bed with fear. But what if you get to go to bed and you don't have any nightmares? Let's say you sleep through the night. You wake up, you're refreshed, and you didn't have any of that fear. Eventually, you'll break that connection between bed equals fear. Okay, same thing with obsessive compulsive disorder or various phobias. If with obsessive compulsive disorder, people will have obsessive thoughts, and in order to stop them or to stop anything bad from supposedly happening, they'll act out on their compulsions, or they'll do behaviors like washing their hands multiple times or flipping a light switch multiple times because they're afraid that if they don't, something terrible will happen. Well, if you don't complete the ritual, like say you don't close the door 3 times and nothing bad happens, then you're starting to slowly break that association and thus break that compulsion. Okay. But unfortunately, after extinction occurs, you can sometimes have spontaneous recovery. Can y'all see this okay? Is it too small? Okay. No, Christian, you good?
No, I can see it fine.
Okay, good. I was making sure. So with spontaneous recovery, this is after you've undergone extinction. Okay, you've broken the association and then somehow randomly it comes back. So say that you've been in a car accident. And so now every time you get into a car, you have a panic attack. Well, let's say you've gone to therapy, you've sat in the car with the therapist in the passenger side, and then they started driving around and you were cool, you were calm, you filled the gas tank, you were cool and you were calm, and then they let you drive and you're cool and you're calm. Well, then months later, okay, you get in the car as you're late for work or something and panic hits you again. Okay, that's spontaneous recovery. That's when after this response has been eliminated, it somehow randomly reappears. So with our example for the night terrors, you've broken that association between the bed and fear, but let's say that randomly through the night you wake up and all of a sudden you have that fear again. Okay, you realize you're in bed. It's not that you had a night terror or anything paired together that would create that response, is that it randomly popped up again. Does that make sense? Now, within these associations, you can have specific responses to only that stimulus, or you can generalize your response to more than one similar stimulus. Y'all notice that with baby Albert, he wasn't just afraid of white rats. Even though he paired the white rats with fear, he actually generalized. He was not only afraid of the rat, he was afraid of bunny rabbits. He was afraid of Santa Claus. He was afraid of dogs. So that's an example of generalization. When similar stimuli, similar to the initial stimuli, elicits a similar response. Okay, say for instance, with our Ivan Pavlov example, let's say he had blew a whistle. He had paired a whistle with the food and that led to the dog salivating. Well, now instead, let's say he rings a bell. Well, if the dog responds with salivation to the bell, the same as if it had been a whistle, that's an example of generalization. Just like in our example with the fear of the car accident. If you suddenly got that fear, no matter what car you were in, it could be in your Toyota Matrix or in a Mazda or in a truck, then that's generalization. It's not the original stimulus, it's all stimulus that are similar to it that elicit that same response. Okay? Okay, so what's the opposite of that? The opposite of generalization is discrimination. Okay, this is your ability to only have the conditioned response to the stimulus that elicited it. Okay, so if baby Albert had only been afraid of white rats, but he was totally cool around teddy bears or totally cool around puppy dogs, then that would be discrimination. He was only afraid of the initial stimulus, only afraid of the white rats. Same thing with our Pavlov example. Let's say that the dogs only salivate in response to the specific whistle that was paired with the food in the first place. You could ring a bell, ring an alarm clock, do an announcement over the intercom. None of that would give the same response. Well, then that means that they have discriminated. They're only going to salivate in response to the specific whistle and specific tone that they have been trained to respond to. Okay? This also ties to something called taste aversion. Taste aversion is a type of classical conditioning that's a little bit different because of how quickly it can occur. Say, for instance, you hate carrots. You had a bad experience with carrots, but you only dislike them raw. You can eat cooked carrots. You can eat carrots mixed with peas, okay? But if it's a raw carrot, it's disgusting. That's discrimination, okay? But if you hate all carrots, whether they're cooked or chopped or raw or with something or by themselves, then that's generalization, okay? Does anyone need a repeat on that? Okay, so to review, extinction is when you no longer have a conditioned response, so you've broken that link. Spontaneous recovery is when that link randomly pops up again. Generalization is when the initial stimulus and similar stimuli elicit the same response. And discrimination is when you are able to determine which is the stimulus you're supposed to respond to and how other similar stimuli aren't supposed to elicit that same response. Okay. Now let's do a quick review of our classical conditioning. I have another FRQ example for y'all. In the scenario, there's a dog named Bullet, okay? And every time he hears his bowl clang, like when you drop it on the ground, he comes running into the kitchen looking for food. I want y'all to figure out what is the UCR, the UCS, the NS, CS, and CR for this situation. And remember, we're dealing with involuntary behavior. So go ahead in the chat, answer what you think it is. Good. The unconditioned stimulus is food. Okay. What is the unconditioned response that the dog has in response to food? Typically, what is our reaction to food? What involuntary behavior? All right. Now, Sam, Bullet running is voluntary. Okay. So that would be operant conditioning. See, it's a trick question. What is our natural unlearned response to food? Hunger. Yes, Bullet hungers for food. So our unconditioned stimulus is food. Unconditioned response is hunger. What's the neutral stimulus that is paired with the food? The bowl clang. When you hear a bowl clang, you don't automatically think, oh, that must mean food. Okay, so they pair the bowl clang with the food enough times that Bullet learns that when he hears that noise, it's feeding time. So now the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, which results in the conditioned response of what? Hunger. Remember that the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are always going to be the same, and they're always going to be involuntary. Good.